I love video games, from the PS1 to the GameCube to the Xbox 360, before finally settling down with the PC. I've been gaming my entire life. And lately I've been on an RPG kick, but I've never really felt tied to one genre in particular. As I was working my way through Digimon Time Stranger after a couple other JRPGs, it got me thinking about genre. In a past video I discussed comedy as a genre in film disappearing in recent years, which you can check out in this video. All of a sudden I realized comedy is even less prevalent in the gaming sphere. Compared to other art forms, video games are still a relatively new medium. Like, music has been around for thousands of years, film for about 100, and video games about half of that. With each generation of technical advancement, we have only just begun to scratch the surface of genre exploration. In the 80s, nearly every game was a side-scroller, not because of stylistic choice, but because of hardware limitations. Video games are in a unique space to be categorized because they can both be defined by style and mechanics. No matter what film you watch, whether it be horror, comedy, or romance, you can only really engage with it technically by watching. The same with music. All you can really do, mechanically at least, is listen to it. But video games are in a unique space for that. Video games require audience input. Games can be described by their mechanics, like first-person shooter, or they can be described stylistically, like a horror game. Usually the two can be combined, such as in survival horror, survival being the gameplay mechanic, and horror being the tone. Resident Evil and Bloodborne are both video games that have horrific imagery and monsters in them, but I would say only one of them is really described as a horror game to most people. I think most people would consider Resident Evil a horror game, while Bloodborne is more of an action game. Well, technically a Souls-like, but that's because they invented Souls-likes, but you know what I mean. As I was scrolling through my Steam library, I realized there was one genre missing: comedy. Yes, there are plenty of funny moments and characters in gaming history, but when was the last time you played a game whose main point was making you laugh, or whose advertising was based around how funny the game was? And just to get it out of the way, I want to talk about the single greatest moment of comedy in gaming history, which is, of course, press F to pay respects. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past 10 years, this is already a part of internet canon, so I don't really need to explain it to you. Press F to pay respects is the perfect storm of self-seriousness, stupidity, and tone deafness that even to this day still makes me laugh when I think about it. I don't know what they were thinking. When I think of funny video game moments, I usually think of unintentionally hilarious things like press F to pay respects or glitchy games like Sonic 06. The hardest laughs I've had in gaming were just kind of dicking around with my friends, and that could have been achieved watching paint dry, for example, so the game itself wasn't necessarily required to generate that comedy. The first time I personally remember a game really pushing its sense of humor as a selling point was Borderlands 2. I didn't play Borderlands 1 and I wasn't aware of it at the time, so I would imagine it was the same thing. At the time I really liked it, but I replayed it recently, and while the game is still fun, the humor is really dated in that early 2000s XD so random style that is just really grating now. Even then, the comedy came from the writing and performances, not necessarily the gameplay itself. The only game I can think of where the actual goal of the player was to generate comedy was the Open Mic Night video game, but that just basically devolved into an N-word shouting simulator. There also was that Neopets game that I used to hate as a kid where you had to make the king laugh. Just come to find out that it's totally random if he likes your joke or not. Fuck you. Back to Borderlands 2, there were a couple of instances where they played with the medium itself, like with the quest to shoot the guy in the face. The UI bluntly states the mission, and upon shooting him in the face, you also get an achievement, which also plays with the mechanics of the game and Steam as a service as well to generate comedy in a really unique way. In this case, I think the game experiments with actually being metatextually a comedy game, albeit just for this one side quest. While the writing may or may not be funny to your taste, the gameplay itself could not be considered a comedy game outside of a few choice encounters. All you really do is kind of shoot people and drive around. In this video, I want to explore if making a game funny via gameplay is something that's even possible and why we haven't seen it very often. First, I want to go over what I consider to be some actual comedy games. First that comes to mind is the WarioWare series of games. These microgame collections have you performing a variety of absurd tasks at breakneck speeds. The premise and resulting microgames are borderline absurdist art. The plot of these games is paper thin, and asking the players to spend their time plucking nose hairs is pretty funny. Another is Untitled Goose Game. Now, I haven't personally played this game, but it always did annoy me how much it was memed about by the quirky Chungus crowd of the time. I remember that AGDQ event with the stream being plagued by people thinking they're funny by just honking all the time, and it really began to annoy me. I don't know, maybe I'm just being a hater or not, but something about this game just rubs me the wrong way. Tell me what you think, if you've played this, if it's good, or if it's just memes. While I can't speak to the quality of the game itself, it definitely sold itself on the humorous premise. Another great example of a comedy game is Thank Goodness You're Here, a self-described slap-former filled to the brim with these hilarious little details and quirky side quests. The game only takes about 2 hours to beat, though, not overstaying its welcome, and calls into question how much comedy could sustain a full-length AAA game, for example. You'll notice that a common denominator in these games that I mentioned are the brevity. Goose Game and Thank Goodness You're Here can both be completed in about 2 to 3 hours, depending on how fast you go, and WarioWare's whole appeal is that each game is beaten in seconds. It seems like developers aren't interested in the time it takes to create a game that is both engaging mechanically and funny. As a comic, I know how long it can take to even write a single one-liner, and with devs being under such incredible pressure all the time, I can't imagine them deciding to delay a game to make sure it's funnier as well as functional. They can barely get games out the door as is. Hideo Kojima is probably the most famous name in video games for messing with the medium of games themselves. Metal Gear Solid famously has you break the fourth wall by switching controller ports to beat Psycho Mantis, and in Snake Eater you can wait a week in real life to have your boss die of old age. These moments are iconic for using the console itself to manipulate the game outside of what is possible in regular gameplay. This is also something that's only really possible in the medium of gaming. Imagine if you're watching the Avengers, and in order for the good guys to beat Thanos with the Reality Stone, you actually have to get up and move theaters to change realities. Okay, that actually sounds pretty fucking sick now that I think about it, but it wouldn't make sense in home viewing scenarios. It would be interesting to see how developers could manipulate both the software and the hardware to generate comedy in a way that only games are capable of. I know that games are largely digital nowadays, but imagine a game where you can make your character vomit or something and the console ejects your disc to simulate throwing up. I think that would be a pretty funny gag. Or a console shaped like the GameCube if a toilet seat is left up and it pops the cover open, for example. I think the Stanley Parable explores this potential more deeply than any other game I've seen, doing things like offering achievements for not playing the game for 10 years and other fourth wall breaking gags. The less I say about this game, the better, as you really should play it for yourselves. I've had some friends of mine describe it as pretty unnerving, but I find the game very funny. South Park Stick of Truth satirizes character creation by having your game difficulty tied to your skin color, although not really, and the Portal games have some of the sharpest comedy writing I've ever seen. As I was writing the script for this, I realized there are plenty of funny video games and funny video game characters, so why hasn't comedy established itself as a genre in gaming? For one, I think players are more interested in what you do in the game rather than the tone. If you heard that a game genre was comedy, it would be unclear if it's a shooter, an RPG, or a dating sim for that matter. Think back to Brutal Legend, which advertised itself as a Tenacious D-style adventure, only to turn into an RTS to the disappointment of many. Gamers are much more interested in how a game plays, and being told it's funny doesn't really help clarify that. Horror, while similar to comedy in many ways, has been able to cement itself as a specific genre, like I mentioned before. When most people hear horror, they probably think of something like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. Another critical aspect of comedy is timing. How often have you dropped a game for a week and then when you come back to it, you forgot what you were supposed to be doing or what the controls were? Think of a classic setup punchline joke structure. Now imagine a game where the setup to a gag is when you walk through the door, you get hit with a pie in the face. Well, if you save right before and pick up the game a week later, you forget the setup and the pie in the face isn't really going to make a lot of sense anymore. Player agency really restricts how jokes can be paced properly, where if a certain trigger needs to be hit for a punchline to play out, then the player running off will ruin the setup for it. If the game is so linear that this can't happen, then the level design suffers. So for now, comedy in video games seems to be reserved for dialogue and cutscenes, while comedy-focused games are more bite-sized experiments like Octodad or Shower with Your Dad. Lots of dad games. So comment below what your favorite funny game is, and if you like what you see, make sure you leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.